There are books that speak not only to the intellect, but to the very essence of what it means to be human. And then, there are books that reach beyond even this, exposing the raw underbelly of existence, the void we so often dare not confront. No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai is one such novel. It is not merely a story, but a profound exploration of alienation, the collapse of identity, and the terrifying abyss that lies in the heart of all those who feel they do not belong. This novel does not whisper to the soul. It screams in anguish, dragging readers into the suffocating despair of its protagonist, Oba Yozo, a man who exists, but can no longer consider himself human. The novel opens with a haunting, prophetic statement. "Mine has been a life of much shame." This single sentence sets the tone for the rest of the story. A tale of an individual who feels so disconnected from society, from the expectations of being human, that he finds himself adrift, untethered from anything that might resemble meaning or purpose. Dazai presents this through a fictionalized autobiography, telling Yozo's life through a series of notebooks where he recounts his descent into shame, despair, and ultimately, a form of self-imposed alienation so profound that it leads to his inevitable disintegration. At the core of No Longer Human is the theme of alienation. Yozo is a man who never feels a part of the world around him. From an early age, he finds himself wearing masks to survive in a society that seems to demand from him a performance he cannot give. He becomes a clown, hiding behind jokes, false smiles, and exaggerated behavior to mask his crippling insecurity and fear. It's as though Yozo is always at a distance, watching himself from the outside, performing life as if it were a charade, and never allowing anyone to see the emptiness that lies beneath his facade. What makes Yozo's alienation so poignant is that he understands, on a profound level, the expectations placed upon him as a man in society. He knows he is supposed to fulfill a role to be strong, responsible, reliable, and yet he finds himself wholly incapable of living up to these ideals. His failure is not just personal, it is existential. He is, in his own eyes, no longer human. He cannot form meaningful connections with others because he does not believe himself to be a person worth knowing. This is the essence of his tragedy. He is trapped in a vicious cycle of self-hatred, a cycle that only deepens as he moves through life, becoming ever more isolated from those around him. As Yozo attempts to navigate life, he finds himself pulled into the darker sides of society. He spirals into alcoholism, addiction, and increasingly destructive relationships with women. Each of these vices serves as a temporary escape, but they also further deepen his sense of shame and alienation. His relationships, particularly with women, are marked by dependency and exploitation. He uses them as a means of self-validation, seeking in their affection some proof that he is still human. But his inability to truly connect with them only leads to more misery. These relationships are fleeting, empty, and destructive, much like Yozo's own sense of self. What stands out in No Longer Human is Dazai's brutal honesty about human nature. He does not offer comfort or redemption. There is no heroic journey here, no moment of self-realization where Yozo triumphs over his demons. Instead, we are left to witness the slow unraveling of a man who cannot find a place for himself in the world. Yozo's despair is not unique, but what makes it so devastating is the clarity with which Dazai writes about it. He does not shy away from the uncomfortable truth that some people simply cannot function within the confines of society, and for them, life becomes an unbearable burden. Philosophically, No Longer Human speaks to the existentialist themes of absurdity and meaninglessness. Yozo's life is one long meditation on the absurdity of existence. He tries, at various points in his life, to conform to societal norms, to find a way to exist as a normal human being, but every attempt is doomed to failure. His alienation is not merely a personal failing. It is an existential condition. Yozo's life could be seen as a reflection of Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of bad faith, in which individuals deceive themselves into believing that they can fulfill the roles that society has imposed upon them. But Yozo is too self-aware to fall into this trap. He knows that he is living a lie, and it is this knowledge that destroys him. Yet, there is also something tragically universal in Yozo's plight. Who among us has not, at some point, felt out of place in the world? Who has not, at some point, felt the weight of societal expectations and wondered whether we are capable of living up to them? Yozo's despair may be extreme, but it taps into something fundamental about the human condition: the fear that, no matter how hard we try, we may never truly belong. Dazai, through Yozo, forces us to confront the possibility that we are all, in some way, alienated from the world around us. The structure of the novel, with its use of notebooks and fragmented storytelling, mirrors Yozo's own fragmented sense of self. There is a sense of disorientation as we move through his life, as if we are sifting through the debris of a shattered identity. Yozo himself is an unreliable narrator, his self-perception colored by his shame and despair. At times, it is difficult to know whether his accounts of events are truthful or whether they are distortions of reality, shaped by his self-loathing. This unreliability only adds to the novel's sense of alienation, as we, like Yozo, are left unsure of what is real and what is a product of his fractured mind. The psychological dimension of No Longer Human is equally profound. Yozo's mental state deteriorates throughout the novel, as he becomes more and more detached from reality. His descent into madness is not sudden but gradual, as the weight of his shame and alienation slowly crushes him. There is a sense of inevitability to his downfall, as though Yozo is trapped in a predetermined fate from which there is no escape. His repeated suicide attempts, his increasing dependency on drugs and alcohol, and his abusive relationships are all symptoms of a man who has lost all sense of purpose and identity. By the end of the novel, Yozo has become a shell of a man, utterly disconnected from any sense of self or humanity. The title of the novel, No Longer Human, is both literal and metaphorical. Yozo has become, in his own eyes, something less than human, something monstrous. He is alive, but he does not feel as though he is truly living. This idea of being no longer human is central to the novel's exploration of identity and alienation. It raises the question, what does it mean to be human? Is it simply a matter of biological existence, or is there something more to it, something that Yozo, in his despair, has lost? For Yozo, being human means being able to connect with others, to fulfill the roles expected of him by society. But he is unable to do this, and as a result, he feels as though he has lost his humanity. There is a deep sense of tragedy in this, for Yozo's alienation is not something he has chosen. It is a result of his inability to reconcile his inner self with the demands of the external world. He is caught between two irreconcilable forces: the desire to be seen, to be known, and the fear that, if anyone truly knew him, they would reject him. This fear of rejection drives Yozo to further isolate himself, creating a vicious cycle of alienation that he cannot escape. In many ways, No Longer Human can be seen as a critique of modern society and its dehumanizing effects. Dazai, through Yozo, explores the ways in which societal norms and expectations can suffocate the individual, forcing them to suppress their true selves in order to conform. Yozo's inability to fit into these roles leads to his downfall, but the novel suggests that the problem lies not with Yozo alone, but with the society that demands such conformity. There is a sense of hopelessness in this critique, as though Dazai is saying that modern society is inherently alienating, and that those who cannot adapt are doomed to be cast aside. At the same time, No Longer Human is also a deeply personal novel, reflecting Dazai's own struggles with mental illness, addiction, and alienation. The novel was written towards the end of Dazai's life, and it is impossible to separate the author from his protagonist. Yozo's despair mirrors Dazai's own, and the novel can be read as a kind of confession, a final attempt to make sense of a life that felt, to Dazai, like a failure. This autobiographical element adds another layer of depth to the novel, as it becomes not just a story about one man's alienation, but a reflection of the author's own tortured soul. What happens to someone who is irreparably disconnected from the human experience? Yozo's journey, and by extension Dazai's vision, ventures into the territory of total estrangement, not just from society, but from the very act of living itself. While earlier we delved into the themes of alienation, shame, and self-destruction, there is still more to examine beneath the novel's surface, particularly in how Yozo's story reflects an existential void, where identity is not just fragmented, but annihilated. One of the most striking elements of No Longer Human is the way it explores the disintegration of the self, not simply as a personal crisis, but as an ontological one. Yozo's alienation is so profound that he begins to lose touch with the very idea of what it means to be a person. This goes beyond a failure to connect with others. It is the collapse of any stable sense of I. His humanity, his sense of being a coherent individual, slips away until he is reduced to a mere observer of his own life, a spectator, watching as everything around him disintegrates, yet powerless to stop it. This gradual erasure of identity is marked by a chilling kind of numbness. Yozo's existence becomes increasingly passive, as though he has lost all agency, all capacity to act upon the world. He drifts through life, his encounters with others growing more fleeting and superficial. The masks he once wore, those exaggerated performances of normalcy, begin to fade, revealing a hollowness within that cannot be filled. In many ways, Yozo is not just alienated from society, but from his own inner world, a place that should be a refuge, but instead is a prison. What makes No Longer Human particularly powerful is how Dazai ties this psychological dissolution to a broader philosophical crisis. Yozo's experience is not unique to him alone. It taps into the existential dread that lies at the core of modern life. This dread is born from the realization that the structures we rely on for meaning, society, identity, relationships, are ultimately fragile, and when they crumble, we are left alone to confront the void. Yozo's unravelling is a slow, painful confrontation with that void, and the novel suggests that this is a universal human experience, even if we do not all fall as deeply into despair as he does. Dazai also explores the idea that the act of living itself can become unbearable when one is too self-aware. Yozo is not just a man who has failed at life. He is someone who is hyper-aware of his failures, someone who sees through the facades of societal norms and expectations, but is unable to escape them. This heightened awareness is not liberating for Yozo, it is paralyzing. He sees the absurdity of the human condition, the futility of trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for him. But this knowledge brings no relief. Instead, it drives him further into the depths of despair, as he realizes that there is no way out. The world continues to demand things from him that he cannot give, and he continues to fail in ways that only deepen his sense of shame. This existential paralysis, this inability to act, to change, to find meaning, is one of the most harrowing aspects of No Longer Human. Yozo is trapped, not just by the world around him, but by his own consciousness. His mind becomes a cage, a place where every thought, every feeling, is distorted by the weight of his alienation. There is no escape for Yozo, not through love, not through friendship, and certainly not through the false comforts of addiction. He is, in the truest sense, alone, not just physically, but metaphysically. His loneliness is total, absolute. And it is this crushing loneliness that ultimately destroys him. And yet, even in this profound isolation, there is something universal about Yozo's plight. While his experiences may be extreme, the feelings he wrestles with, fear, shame, self-doubt, are deeply human. In this way, No Longer Human speaks to something we all understand on some level: the terror of not being enough, of not living up to the expectations placed upon us by others, and even more devastatingly, by ourselves. Yozo's failures are, in a sense, our failures, amplified and exaggerated, but no less real. His despair is a reflection of our own fears, our own insecurities. We see in him the parts of ourselves we often try to hide, the parts that question whether we, too, might one day find ourselves lost. disconnected, and no longer human. As the novel reaches its bleak conclusion, we are left not with answers, but with more questions. What does it mean to be human? Is it simply a matter of existing, of going through the motions of life? Or is there something deeper, something more essential that Yozo has lost, or perhaps never had? These are questions that Dazai leaves open, allowing the reader to grapple with them long after the story has ended. No Longer Human is not just a novel about one man's descent into despair. It is a meditation on what it means to be alive in a world that can feel cold, indifferent, and hostile. It is a story about the masks we wear, the roles we play, and the deep, often unacknowledged fear that, beneath it all, we may not be who we think we are. Dazai's masterpiece challenges us to confront the darkest parts of ourselves and to ask whether, in the face of alienation and despair, we can still call ourselves human.